smuggling, execution, espionage, and slavery. Those are not the ingredients listed on your morning latte, but they probably should be. Coffee is the second most traded commodity on the planet, right behind crude oil. Over 2 billion cups are consumed every single day across the globe. The industry generates more annual revenue than the GDP of most countries. And the story of how a wild berry growing in the Ethiopian forest ended up in your kitchen is one of the strangest, bloodiest, and most fought-over tales in human history. What nobody knew when a goat herder first noticed his animals acting strange after eating red berries off a wild shrub was that he had just stumbled onto something that would topple empires, fuel revolutions, and reshape the economies of entire continents. But this story does not start with the cup in your hand. It starts with a goat. Sometime around the 9th century, in the forested highlands of Ethiopia, a young goat herder named Kaldi noticed something odd about his flock. After grazing near a particular bush covered in bright red berries on a hillside near the town of Kafir, his goats started acting erratic. They were jumping around, bleeding louder than usual, butting heads with each other, and refusing to sleep at night. Kaldi watched this go on for a few days before he decided to try the berries himself. Within minutes, he felt a rush of energy he had never experienced before. His exhaustion vanished, his mind sharpened. He had just had the world's first cup of coffee, more or less. Now, whether Kaldi was a real person or a legend that grew over centuries of retelling, nobody can say for certain. The earliest written version of this story does not appear until the 15th century, hundreds of years after it supposedly happened. But the geography checks out. Wild coffee plants, the species known as Coffea arabica, still grow in the highland forests of Ethiopia to this day. They thrive at elevations between 1,000 and 2,000 in the cool shade beneath the forest canopy. And the region around Kaffa in southwestern Ethiopia is widely considered the birthplace of coffee as we know it. The plant had been growing wild there for thousands of years before anyone figured out what to do with it. Indigenous communities in Ethiopia had been chewing coffee leaves and crushing the berries into a paste mixed with animal fat for energy, long before anyone thought to roast and brew them. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Kaldi reportedly brought his discovery to a local monastery, where a monk dismissed the berries as the work of the devil and threw them into a fire. But as the berries roasted in the flames, they released an aroma so rich and intoxicating that the other monks came running from across the courtyard. They raked the roasted beans from the coals, crushed them into a rough powder, dissolved the grounds in hot water, and drank the result. That night, they stayed awake through their entire evening prayer service without a single nod of drowsiness. Word spread fast through the monasteries of the Ethiopian highlands. The monks had found something extraordinary, and they were not about to keep it to themselves. But it was across the Red Sea in Yemen, where coffee truly became a force that reshaped daily life. By the 15th century, Sufi monks in the Yemeni port cities had turned coffee drinking into a spiritual practice. They called the drink kahwa, an old Arabic word that originally referred to wine. And they used it specifically to stay awake during long nights of religious devotion, prayer circles, and chanting rituals called dhikr. The Sufis were not drinking coffee for pleasure or socializing. They were drinking it because they believed it sharpened their minds and brought them closer to the divine. Coffee was their secret tool for worship, and they guarded the knowledge carefully. Yemen became the first country to cultivate coffee as an actual crop, growing it on terraced hillsides in the mountains outside the city of Sana'a. The port city of Mocha on the Red Sea coast became the center of the global coffee trade, and the name stuck. When you hear the word mocha today in a coffee shop in Paris or New York, You are hearing an echo of a Yemen harbor town that controlled the world's coffee supply for 200 years. Every single coffee bean that left the Arabian Peninsula for the outside world shipped through that port, and the Yemenis were smart about protecting their advantage. They boiled or partially roasted every bean before export to make sure nobody could plant a viable seed outside their borders. Coffee was their monopoly, and they intended to keep it that way. This decision seemed small at the time, but it was not because the rest of the world had tasted coffee, and the rest of the world wanted more. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled vast stretches of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe, embraced coffee with an obsession that bordered on mania. By the early 1500s, coffee houses had sprung up across Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Mecca. These were not quiet places. Ottoman coffee houses were loud, crowded, smoke-filled social hubs where men gathered to discuss politics, recite poetry, play backgammon and chess, listen to storytellers, and gossip about the Sultan and his court. The Turks called these establishments kavahain, and within decades, they had become the social backbone of Ottoman urban life. Some historians estimate that Istanbul alone had over 600 coffee houses by the middle of the 16th century, and that terrified the people in power because when ordinary citizens gather in large numbers and start talking openly about politics, rulers tend to get nervous. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg, tried to ban coffee entirely. He claimed it was an intoxicant forbidden by Islamic law, rounded up coffee drinkers for questioning, and shut down the coffee houses in the city. The ban lasted barely a year before the Sultan in Cairo overruled him, and Khair Beg himself was eventually removed from his post. But the tension between coffee lovers and the authorities was just getting started. The most extreme crackdown came from Sultan Murad IV, who ruled the Ottoman Empire in the 1630s. Murad was a man who did not believe in half measures. He banned coffee outright, shut down every coffee house across Istanbul, and reportedly ordered that anyone caught drinking coffee should be beaten for the first offense and drowned in the Bosphorus for the second. Some accounts describe him wandering the streets of the capital in disguise at night, personally executing coffee drinkers he caught in the act. Whether every detail of that is true or slightly exaggerated by later historians, the message was unmistakable. Coffee had become so deeply embedded in Ottoman social life that the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth considered it a direct threat to his authority. And somehow things got even more complicated, because while the Ottoman sultans were busy trying to stamp coffee out, the drink had already escaped their borders and arrived in Europe, and Europe lost its collective mind. The first European coffee houses opened in Venice around 1620, brought by Italian merchants who had tasted the drink during trade expeditions to Ottoman ports in the eastern Mediterranean. The reaction from the Catholic Church was immediate and hostile. Priests in Rome declared coffee to be the bitter invention of Satan himself, arguing that this dark exotic drink from the Muslim world was a tool of the devil designed to corrupt Christian souls and lure them away from communion wine. They petitioned Pope Clement VIII to ban it outright, and a formal hearing was convened at the Vatican. So the Pope did what any reasonable person would do. He asked to try it first, and after taking a sip, he reportedly said something along the lines of, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it, and that they should cheat Satan by baptizing it." And just like that, coffee got the papal stamp of approval, which, looking back, was either one of the shrewdest political moves in Vatican history or one of the funniest, depending on who you ask. Within decades, coffee houses were everywhere in Europe, and they were changing the way entire societies functioned. London alone had over 3,000 coffee houses by the early 1700s. They called them penny universities because, for the price of a single penny cup of coffee, anyone could sit and listen to some of the sharpest minds in England debate philosophy, natural science, business ventures, and colonial politics. These were not exclusive salons for the wealthy. Merchants, sailors, writers, scientists, and political radicals all crowded the same benches. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House in Tower Street became the birthplace of Lloyd's of London, one of the world's most famous insurance markets. Jonathan's Coffee House on Exchange Alley became the foundation of what would eventually evolve into the London Stock Exchange. Isaac Newton spent hours in coffee houses discussing mathematics. The poet Alexander Pope practically lived in Button's Coffee House in Covent Garden. And in France, the Café Procope in Paris, which opened in 1686, hosted Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and Benjamin Franklin at various points. Voltaire reportedly drank somewhere between 40 and 50 cups of coffee a day, which honestly explains a lot about his output. But the Europeans had a problem. They were completely dependent on Yemen for their supply, and the Yemenis were not about to share their monopoly willingly. Every attempt to smuggle viable coffee seeds out of Yemen was met with resistance. The trade routes were controlled. The beans were treated before export, and the Yemeni authorities had every reason to maintain their stranglehold on the market. The clock was already ticking. The Yemenis just could not hear it yet. Because in 1616, a Dutch trader named Pieter van den Broek managed to steal a live coffee plant from the port of Mocha and smuggle it back to Amsterdam aboard a merchant ship. The Dutch East India Company successfully cultivated it in their botanical gardens in the Netherlands. And then they did what colonial powers always did. They took it to their territories overseas. The Dutch planted coffee across their colonies in Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, and in Java, part of present-day Indonesia. The island of Java became so synonymous with coffee production that the word Java is still used as slang for coffee, over 400 years later. The Dutch also established coffee plantations in Suriname on the northern coast of South America, using enslaved labor imported from West Africa. But the Dutch were not the only European empire with coffee ambitions. France wanted in on the trade, and they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get it. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu set out on a voyage from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris to the Caribbean island of Martinique. He was carrying a single coffee plant, a cutting from a tree that had been gifted to King Louis XIV by the Dutch, housed in a glass case on the deck of his ship. The journey was a disaster from the start. The ship was attacked by Tunisian pirates in the Mediterranean. A violent storm nearly capsized them in the open Atlantic. A fellow passenger, reportedly jealous of de Clieu's mission, or simply unhinged, tried to rip the plant from its case and destroy it. De Clieu fought him off, but a branch was torn away. Then the ship's freshwater supply ran dangerously low, and the captain ordered strict rationing. De Clieu shared his own daily water ration with the coffee plant to keep it alive. Going thirsty himself for weeks, he arrived in Martinique, sunburned, dehydrated, and exhausted with the plant barely clinging to life. He nursed it back to health in the volcanic soil of the island. And within a few years, that single plant had produced enough seedlings to establish coffee plantations across the entire French Caribbean. Almost every coffee plant in Central America and large portions of South America can trace its genetic lineage back to that one scraggly cutting on de Clieu's ship. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about how coffee conquered an entire continent. In 1727, the Portuguese government in Brazil realized they were sitting on millions of acres with perfect coffee growing conditions, tropical climate, rich soil, and cheap labor, but no access to the plant itself. The French and Dutch were guarding their coffee colonies jealously, and nobody was interested in sharing. So, Brazil sent a man named Francisco de Melo Palheta to the colony of French Guiana on a supposed diplomatic mission to help mediate a border dispute between the French and Dutch settlements. Palheta was handsome, charming, well-spoken, and according to the historical record, very good at his actual job, which was espionage. While negotiating the border agreement in the city of Cayenne, Palheta allegedly began an affair with the wife of the French colonial governor. When the time came for him to leave and return to Brazil, she gave him an elaborate farewell bouquet of flowers at a public banquet. Hidden inside the bouquet were fertile coffee seeds and cuttings. Palheta brought them back across the border to Brazil, planted them in the northern state of Para, and within decades, coffee cultivation had spread south through the states of Maranhão, Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. Brazil transformed itself into the largest coffee producer on the face of the earth, a title it still holds today, producing roughly a third of the world's coffee supply every year. I mean, think about that for a second. The entire Brazilian coffee industry, worth tens of billions of dollars annually, exists because of a seduction scheme at a dinner party in 1727. But the expansion of coffee across the tropics came at an unimaginable human cost. And this is where the story stops being a quirky adventure and becomes something much darker. The coffee plantations that spread across the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and Southeast Asia were overwhelmingly built on the labor of enslaved people. The Dutch used enslaved workers from West Africa and forced local populations into labor on their plantations in Java and Suriname. The French relied on enslaved Africans in Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, where the conditions were so horrific that Haiti's coffee and sugar plantations became one of the primary catalysts for the Haitian Revolution of 1791. And Brazil, which would eventually dwarf every other coffee-producing nation combined, ran its massive coffee fazendas almost entirely on enslaved labor until abolition came in 1887. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, and coffee was one of the primary economic engines that kept the institution alive for as long as it did. The conditions on these plantations were brutal. Workers on Brazilian coffee estates in the Paraíba Valley and around São Paulo labored from before dawn until after dark, clearing dense Atlantic forest, planting seedlings, harvesting ripe coffee cherries by hand under the tropical sun, and processing the beans in open-air terreiros. Death rates were staggering. Plantation owners called fazendeiros calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements from the transatlantic slave trade than to invest in better food, shelter, or medical care. The wealth that coffee generated flowed upward to landowners in Brazil and commodity traders in London, Amsterdam, and New York, while the human cost was borne almost entirely by African and indigenous people who never saw a fraction of the profits. But this was not just about one crop anymore. Coffee had become woven into the entire machinery of European colonialism, inseparable from the plantation system that defined the economies of 3 continents, meanwhile an ocean away. Coffee was about to play an unexpected role in the birth of a new nation. In December of 1773, American colonists in Boston Harbor dumped 342 chests of British East India Company tea into the freezing water to protest taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party was a political act, but it had a very practical side effect. Drinking tea suddenly became unpatriotic in the American colonies. Merchants who sold British tea were harassed and boycotted. Tea drinkers were mocked as loyalists and sympathizers, and Americans needed a replacement for their daily drink. Coffee filled that void almost overnight. Within a few years, coffee had replaced tea as the preferred drink across the 13 colonies. Coffee houses in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston became gathering places where organizers of the independence movement planned their next moves. The Merchants Coffee House in New York hosted some of the earliest meetings of what would become the government of the new republic, and the cultural shift stuck permanently. To this day, the United States consumes more coffee than any other single nation on the planet. Americans drink roughly 400 million cups of coffee every single day. And the roots of that habit trace directly back to a political protest in Boston Harbor over 250 years ago. The timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. The 19th century turned coffee from a luxury product into an everyday commodity, available to working people across the Western world. Steam-powered ships made transatlantic trade faster and cheaper than ever before. The development of industrial roasting equipment in cities like New York and Hamburg allowed companies to process coffee beans at massive scale for the first time. And the invention of vacuum-sealed tin packaging meant roasted coffee could be shipped across continents and stored on grocery shelves for months without losing its flavor. By the mid-1800s, coffee had gone from a drink of the European elite and the colonial upper class to a staple of factory workers, farmers, and soldiers on 2 continents. Then came the wars, and coffee went from a household drink to a military asset. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers received coffee beans as part of their daily field rations, and they treated those beans like gold. They carried personal grinders in their packs. They roasted green beans over campfires using tin cups and rifle barrels. When supplies ran low, soldiers would trade tobacco, sugar, even ammunition with Confederate pickets across enemy lines. Because the Confederacy, cut off from imports by the Union naval blockade, was completely desperate for coffee, Southern soldiers resorted to brewing substitutes from roasted chicory root, sweet potatoes, and acorns, but nothing came close. Many historians argue that the North's reliable access to coffee through its supply chain was an actual strategic advantage in the war. Soldiers wrote more about coffee in their letters, home, and personal diaries than they wrote about almost any other subject, including combat. One Union soldier stationed in Virginia reportedly wrote that he believed coffee was more important to the war effort than gunpowder. Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, once called coffee one of the greatest necessities of the army. The world wars of the 20th century cemented coffee's place in American and global culture even further. The United States military purchased so much coffee during World War I that it created severe domestic shortages back home, and the government had to intervene to stabilize prices and prevent hoarding. American soldiers in the trenches of France drank coffee to stay alert during night watches and to warm themselves in the freezing mud of no man's land. It was during this war that the term cup of joe entered the American vocabulary, possibly named after Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, who had banned alcohol on naval ships in 1914, making coffee the strongest drink available to sailors. During World War II, the military commissary system distributed millions of packets of instant coffee to soldiers deployed across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Nescafe and Maxwell House became household names, largely because of their enormous military contracts, and returning soldiers brought their coffee habits home with them to suburbs across America. The post-war boom of the 1950s and 60s saw coffee become the unquestioned default American beverage, with brands like Folgers and Maxwell House dominating grocery store shelves, diner counters, and television advertising during prime time. But something happened in the 1960s and 70s that the major coffee companies did not anticipate. Quality collapsed. In the race to produce coffee as cheaply as possible for the mass market, the big roasters started blending lower-grade Robusta beans with Arabica, cutting corners on the roasting process, and prioritizing shelf life and uniformity over flavor. By the 1970s, American supermarket coffee was, to put it bluntly, terrible, weak, stale, bitter, and over-extracted. The per capita consumption of coffee in the United States actually declined for the first time in the country's history. Young people in particular were turning away from the watery brown liquid their parents drank every morning. If coffee had stopped here, this would be a very different story. But in 1971, three friends named Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Boker opened a small shop called Starbucks in the Pike Place Market neighborhood of Seattle, Washington. They did not sell brewed coffee at first. They sold high-quality whole roasted beans imported from small farms along with brewing equipment and tea. Their focus was on educating customers about where coffee came from and how to prepare it properly. It was a niche business in a niche neighborhood, and it stayed that way for a decade. Then, in 1992, a young marketing director named Howard Schultz joined the company. The following year, Schultz traveled to Milan, Italy on a buying trip and walked into an espresso bar in the city center. He watched the barista pull shots of espresso with precision and care. He saw regulars greeting each other by name at the counter. He noticed the ritual of it, the theater. The community that formed around a well-made cup of coffee in a beautiful space. And he decided that this was what coffee in America was missing. Not just better beans, but the entire experience. Schultz eventually bought Starbucks from its founders, transformed it from a bean retailer into a cafe chain, and built an empire that changed the way the world thinks about coffee. By the mid-1990s, Starbucks had gone from a single Seattle storefront to a publicly traded company with hundreds of locations stretching from coast to coast. The company made coffee aspirational again. Ordering a grande latte with oat milk became a cultural signal as much as a beverage choice, and the ripple effect spread far beyond one company. Independent roasters and specialty coffee shops emerged in every major city across the United States and Europe, sourcing single-origin beans directly from farms in Colombia, Ethiopia, Guatemala, and Kenya. Baristas started competing in international championships. Coffee was treated with the same seriousness and vocabulary that the wine industry applies to grapes. The third wave coffee movement, as it came to be called, turned coffee from a background commodity into something people genuinely cared about understanding. Today, the global coffee industry generates over $400 billion in revenue annually. More than 125 million people around the world depend on coffee farming for their livelihoods. Coffee is grown in more than 70 countries across the tropical belt from Brazil and Colombia to Vietnam, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. Brazil still leads production by a wide margin, harvesting over 60 million bags of coffee per year across sprawling estates in states like Minas Gerais and São Paulo. Vietnam has become the world's second largest producer, largely through Robusta cultivation in the central highlands around the city of Buon Ma Thuot. Colombia remains famous for its washed Arabica grown on small family farms in the Andes Mountains. And Ethiopia, the country where that goat herder supposedly noticed his flock acting strange over 1,000 years ago, remains one of the most celebrated origins in the specialty coffee world. Beans from regions like Yirgachev, Sidamo, and Guji are praised for their floral and fruity flavor profiles that taste unlike coffee from anywhere else on earth. The coffee plant, in a sense, has returned home as a global celebrity. The journey from a wild shrub in the Ethiopian highlands to a $400 billion global industry involved espionage, religious controversy, colonial exploitation, political revolution, technological innovation, and corporate reinvention. Every cup you drink carries the weight of that history. The beans were first guarded by Yemen merchants who understood their value and boiled them to prevent theft. They were smuggled across oceans by colonial spies who risked their lives for a single plant. They were cultivated by enslaved people who never tasted the profits of their own labor. They fueled the thinkers of the Enlightenment in the coffee houses of London and Paris. They were weaponized in a political protest against British taxation in Boston Harbor. They were rationed in wartime trenches on 2 continents. They were nearly ruined by corporate cost-cutting in the 1970s, and they were rescued by a man who walked into the right espresso bar in Milan at exactly the right moment. Coffee is not just a drink. It is 500 years of human ambition, greed, ingenuity, and cruelty, all brewed into a single cup. And the odds are good that you will pour one tomorrow morning, without thinking twice about any of it. But now you know the real story. If this video changed the way you think about your morning coffee, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of the story surprised you the most.